Welcome to a special edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. This week, our guests are Congressman Chuy Garcia representing Chicago. He's also the co-chair of the Future of Transportation Caucus, and Beth Osborne, the Director of Transportation for America. As the transit crisis deepens, we'll look at how Washington is responding and why transit is about inequality, health, and climate. We'll also learn more about the Future of Transportation Caucus and what it hopes to achieve in Congress. And is there a chance for rewriting the rules for federal transportation funding? Lastly, we'll examine what is the role of grassroots organizations in prioritizing transit. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Policy Mobility Update. As the transit crisis deepens, we've got two leaders to talk to us about what is it that is happening in D.C., what's happening in the Beltway, and why is transit so important? Let's start, as we always do, with our two new guests. We have Congressman Chuy Garcia, who's from the 4th Congressional District of Illinois, representing Chicago. He's also the co-chair of the Congressional Future of Transportation Caucus. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for the invite. Delighted to be here. I've got 3 quick hits. I want to break them out in the order of urgency. One, we've got immediate needs. Transit agencies desperately need support to stay solvent, and that's why the industry is asking Congress for $32 billion in immediate relief. That has to come first because we can't let transit agencies shudder. 2, in the mid to long term, we need to shake up the status quo in Washington, fight the headwinds, and advocate for transit equity for transit and highways. And we have to tackle the misconceptions that electric vehicles are the ultimate solution to our sustainability issues. And finally, I want to talk about the Future of Transportation Caucus that I launched with 2 other colleagues, and our plans to double down on moving the conversation in Congress and building on more on-hill infrastructure, both for organizing purposes and the education of the institution.
That's great. Let's also welcome our other panelist, Beth Osborne, who is no stranger to this podcast, who's the Director of Transportation for America. Also, Beth was a former Obama administration official in the U.S. Department of Transportation. Welcome, Beth. What are your hits?
My number 1 hit is that conversation around a COVID relief bill has completely stalled, and not just in the way we've heard about in recent weeks. It's now being discussed in terms of a September conversation, which means those transit needs at best will be answered in September. And I really only have one other hit, which is we've come off of a great virtual rally, including Representative Garcia, with a bunch of the large transit systems and mid-sized transit systems across the country. We're now talking about going forward and doing something similar with smaller transit systems to remind people this isn't just a big city issue, and often in smaller areas there's even greater transit dependence.
Great. Well, let's unpack those issues. We'll start with you, Congressman. You had discussed earlier before the show about the fact that things are stalled out. That gives us an opportunity. What are you hearing within the Beltway most recently?
Well, I have to admit, I watched a YouTube segment of your May show, and Beth hit it right on the nail when she said that the notion of COVID relief packages would be that the notion that there would be regular relief packages was laughable, and it has, as evidenced by the breakdown in the talks, been extremely difficult politically to find common ground. So I'm hearing today that the likelihood of an agreement is fleeing with the convention for Democrats coming up next week and Republicans the following week. It looks like we may go into September. Very bad news. Also really distressed that there wasn't a real serious conversation about assistance to states and localities, local governments. They're hurting. They've hemorrhaged tremendous amounts of money. Their revenue streams have been interrupted. That will just translate into lots of hurt for ordinary people in rural areas, in small towns, and in cities and states across the country. You know, it was clear also on the transportation front that the $25 billion for transit in the CARES Act wasn't enough. So that situation has only exacerbated. It's becoming as critical as is the status of the future of the post office, which is being just, defunded severely and is a huge threat against our democracy. So I'm concerned on so many fronts. The fact that people aren't going to get a check potentially until September. I'm concerned about evictions. What the president issued was not really an executive order that will prevent evictions. People are hurting all over the place. Many immigrants were left out of the CARES Act, about 15 million of them, U.S. citizen-born children, U.S. citizen spouses married to someone who isn't a resident yet. So there's lots of hurt. And then, of course, we're not addressing the funding that schools need to reopen, whether it's virtual or hybrid or in person. So we're in a really, really bad position, and it looks very gloomy today.
And so many students rely on transit to get to school or to be able to get to where they need to go. And that continues to be a crisis. During this period of, we'll just call it quiet, is there an opportunity for people outside the Beltway, Beth, to organize? And I'd welcome your thoughts, Congressman, as well. Like during this interim period, during the two conventions, what should the public be doing? And because we have funders who listen to this and watch the show, what should they know that could be done in the short term?
I think we have to view it as an opportunity because we don't have another choice. We're going to take these next several weeks and we need to tell stories about real people. Statistics are useful, but they should come behind the stories about how this is impacting real people. That's what really moves the conversation. It's easier to write a story for the press around something that is real and human. And so we just need to spend these next few weeks placing stories, telling how this is going to impact or is already impacting real people, and tracking the trends so that when conversations restart, they have these issues in mind. Congressman Garcia mentioned the foreclosure crisis, something that accompanies a foreclosure crisis, but we haven't had as much conversation about, is car repossessions. And a lot of people are going to allow their cars to be repossessed before they stop making payments on their homes. And so if we had a large transit dependent population before, that is only going to grow, and therefore essential workers, essential jobs continuing to be effective, and any semblance of an economy is going to be reliant on people being able to get to the things they need in their jobs.
Right.
And Daryl, a quick snapshot in Chicago, over 60% of riders are Black or Latino. 60% of riders during COVID responded to a survey indicating that they rely entirely on transit to get to essential services like healthcare, work, groceries, daycare. Of course, from the equity perspective, you can't forget that those who rely on transit in the first place are also the ones most likely to be deemed essential, and also the folk who have little financial ability to go to work. So the disproportionate impact continues, and the inequities are, have brutal consequences with the folks that are earning the lowest wages, are essential workers, and hugely impactful of people of color.
Well, Congressman, you're right in telling us the local story. I know that you participated in a rally, a virtual rally that Beth had led along with Senator Schumer to discuss the importance of transit. And I think during this period of time, we're certainly looking for more stories to localize the crisis, to make people realize that it's not an abstraction, that people need to get to work, they need to get to healthcare, and they can't, especially essential workers, which is, we know, roughly 30% of all essential workers rely on transit. This is a time when we need to be collecting those stories and letting the public know that transit should be prioritized. Beth, talk a little bit more about how community frontline groups are organizing. And I know, Congressman Garcia, you've been speaking with them as well. I'd like to hear from both of you about what is it that frontline groups can be doing to prioritize transit?
Well, those frontline groups, first, just by elevating this as an issue that has to do with racial justice, with climate, and making those connections, is important. Also, they are the collectors of the stories. They're the what my organization cannot be in thousands of communities at once. It is our connection with those frontline groups that make it possible for us to put together the most compelling stories and connect it to the policymakers that need to know those stories. I also think as we are moving into a new phase of the COVID pandemic, when we first got together to discuss these issues in March, everyone was hopeful this was something that was going to impact us for weeks or maybe a few months. We are moving into a time where I think folks are recognizing that this is going to go on for quite some time. And we're going into what's likely to be a difficult fall and winter as COVID and flu come together. And it's the folks in those local communities that are both aware of some of the solutions that can help us weather this over the long haul, but also can communicate to us how this change is starting to impact people so that we can be creative together and come up with ways to do something, not on a month-by-month discussion basis, but what are we going to do to make everything work for everyone over the next 12 months minimum?
That's great. Congressman, let's talk a little bit about why transit is so important to your constituents. You've mentioned some of the issues around equality and inequality. It's clear that it is the nexus of climate, health, economy, opportunity, access is important. Why did the caucus start up, the Future of Transportation Caucus start up in the last year?
So the Future of Transportation Caucus was initiated by Ayanna Presley from Massachusetts, Mark Takano from the West Coast, and yours truly from Chicago's Gold Coast, because we recognize the urgency and the importance that transit and transportation plays in the lives of everyday people. The Future of Transportation Caucus has a critical role in laying the groundwork for moving the needle on changing transportation policy in a fundamental way. In all the topics we discussed, it's clear that education of stakeholders, including inside legislative institutions and outside, that needs to happen. And that's where the caucus comes in. We recognize that the transportation formulas, which are on automatic pilot, is what contributes to urban sprawl, to inequality, to segregation, and that helps explain why people in many communities and cities all over the country are prevented from access to jobs, access to transportation to downtown areas, to cultural institutions, and they harbor tremendous inequality. So we see the caucus as playing a key role in starting to tackle the antiquated metrics of level of service and the antiquated planning concept that prioritizes, for example, speed limits and the width of roads as a measure of how good a road is, rather than the actual time it takes to get from point A to point B. And two, coupling the idea of transit-oriented development and equity. Transit-oriented development is great, but in Chicago and in other cities, it's been more a force for displacement and gentrification than not. The bill that we passed, HR 2, creates an Office of Transit Supportive Communities, which we hope will focus on equity and affordable housing. The bill included an amendment that I authored that doubled the required percentage of affordable units in adjacent transit-oriented residential development. So we want to shake it up. We want to change the status quo. And we see the need for both an inside strategy by educating our colleagues in Congress and their staffs, but also allying with advocates on the ground, outside organizers, to drive the point home and to make it urban and rural, because it's good for the country.
So my transportation nerd heart just beats pitter patter when I hear a member of Congress talk about lane widths and level of service, and you just saw the power of the Future of Transportation Caucus in that we have members who understand not just the connection between policy and outcomes, but the connection between policy and in the weeds project development processes that can make or break those policies, and also the connection to the built environment. We treat transportation so often as an end unto itself, and not a means for people who live in housing to get to the things that they need. And Representative Garcia gets that, Representative Takano and Presley get that, and they were the first group to not just stand up and say, let's talk about it, but pull their colleagues into briefings with real experts from across the country. And that those conversations moved into amendments and bills and action. And we had conversations about outcomes from transportation during the House debate that I have not seen since I've been working on Capitol Hill since 1997.
And that House debate was long. I felt it was like 16 or 17 hours long. I was dipping in and out of it, and the level of conversation was complete and deep for any transportation nerd or any person concerned about mobility. Another evidence of the power of your caucus is there was recently a sign-on letter that was launched that argued for prioritization of transit, and I think there was something like 30 members that signed on to that letter. That was pretty impressive. That clearly comes because of the leadership of members of Congress, but also because grassroots are putting information in the hands of members of Congress and working to educate them and get them to move forward on that important issue and prioritizing the issue of prioritizing transit. Congressman Garcia, you've worked both in a foundation and you've also worked in advocacy groups. What is the role of grassroots in prioritizing transit? How can they play a role? How can foundations help those grassroots during this most critical of times?
So this time that we live in is, I think, most opportune to advance the role that transportation plays in the development of cities and suburban communities. And given the momentum that the conversations taking place nationally around racial justice, around gentrification, around creating more opportunity for everyone in cities and suburban communities to thrive and to grow and to build safer, healthier communities, transportation plays a key role. So we want to elevate the role of transportation as a force for planners to take into account climate change and carbon footprint, the role of highways in getting us to where we are. In other words, you have to understand the root of the problems and the history of how we got to today and the problems of today in order to understand the solutions for tomorrow. Transportation plays a critical role in addressing climate change, in addressing inequality and racial justice. And right now, I'm very excited about the debate going on in the country, the discussions and the agreement that we have to reset things and that we need a more equitable, sustainable economy for everyone in our midst. And let me just say, we also began the conversation and we fought hard to tackle the question of induced demand. And in so doing, started to socialize the concept that more roads cause more congestion, not the other way around. We also want to take the conversation to the topic of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are not a panacea. They're not the solution for climate change or for congestion or for greater mobility. They have a place. It is a part of the solution, but it isn't the end. So those are the types of conversations that we're having, and it involves housing, it involves healthcare, it involves disparities, health disparities in particular, and what kind of country and cities and rural areas we need for mobility to ensure that everyone has a shot at prosperity.
And I would just like to jump onto that and say that it should be enough for us to care about those who are most often underrepresented and most often underinvested in. But I remember having a conversation with a leader from Salt Lake City when they were first undertaking a visioning process to support more smart growth, development, more transit, things like that. And one of the most powerful things they pointed out was even for your own children, even if you aren't among the disinvested communities, people don't come out of high school and college able to just buy multiple vehicles and drive themselves everywhere and buy ranch homes. And I go back to my own personal experience where I could not find a job because I didn't have a car, and I couldn't get a car because I couldn't find a job. And what happened was the state of Louisiana lost me, and I moved to Washington, D.C., where I could live in a more expensive house, but without a vehicle. And coming forward and saying that you would have given me an electric vehicle in that circumstance did not fix my problem. And from an environmental perspective, why wouldn't we want people to have the chance to just live vehicle free if that is what they choose, rather than something that is going to have climate impacts even beyond the tailpipe, just from the manufacturing, the fueling and disposing of the car, and all the pavement we have to supply for that electric vehicle. I wish it was enough to just care about disinvested communities, but it turns out even people who come from real money, they should be worrying about their own kids who are going to face a lot of the same circumstances.
So those are all legitimate reasons. And it feels like if you care about housing, if you care about health, if you care about anything about quality of life and people, then collaborating with other funders, all those funders need to work together to be supporting grassroots groups to support biking, walking, and transit. And I think, Congressman, you were right about saying electric vehicles have their role, but it's not a panacea. And we certainly ought to push, if we have to have cars, we have to have vehicles, then they should at minimum be electric. But that's not the panacea. Let's talk a little bit more about the role of grassroots. Like, Congressman, from your perspective, having been an organizer, grassroots person, and now as a member of Congress, what are the best ways that you find valuable when grassroots are trying to impress upon you the importance of something? What do you find the most impressive?
When young organizers, and I think we're about to experience a huge growth supply of those change makers, are going to be impacting policies at the very local level in small towns and villages and suburban communities. Certainly in Chicago, where that is well on its way. It's a new day in Chicago politics, a bit rocky, but I think a sign of progress. I think similarly, many of the national organizing networks are going to be reinvigorated. They're going to have a tremendous presence in Congress. I'm looking forward to their presence and impact in the 117th Congress of the United States. I thought the 116th was a phenomenal class, a snapshot of the future in America. I think grassroots and change in the legislative body at the national level, certainly a new administration, which could become a reality, all bode very well for the country and for change, especially on this subject of transportation and equity and racial justice for everyone in the country. So I'm very, very excited, coming from an organizing background, staying rooted in my neighborhood, in my barrio, in the city of Chicago. And I feel like in spite of the COVID crisis, in spite of the tremendous recession we are experiencing, that there is reason to be optimistic about the future. And I think that grassroots organizing is going to get a huge shot in the arm. It may come at the same time as a new vaccine for COVID-19.
That's exciting. And Beth, what's your take on all of this? Oh, you're muted. No one can mute you except Zoom, Beth.
I keep fearing that my children will just pop in and start making noise. So I try to mitigate against that. Yeah, I don't think this is something that we can work out here in Washington, D.C. by ourselves. And frankly, what's going on locally is different across the nation. We face a lot of the same challenges, obviously, but transit systems in particular are of different size. The economy is different in different places. The sorts of economic drivers are different in different places, and that all comes together to impact them differently. We, as Transportation for America, have always found our strength in our network of local advocates and local leaders who can tell us how the various things we're thinking about would impact them locally and allow us to develop ideas and share them with policymakers that make sense for the most communities across the country. We simply can't do our job well without those connections and without that insight into what's happening. On transit, we're having conversations right now with big transit systems like CTA and MTA, but we're also having conversations with smaller services like New Orleans RTA in my hometown, and also very small systems like a bunch of rural transit systems in Oklahoma. Right. And while they all have a lot of similar challenges, they all have very specific challenges to their circumstances, and that's where we get our ideas and our inspiration from. We just can't do our job well without them.
That's great. Well, we're coming up against the time that we need to close out. I always like to pop a question that is related to what we work on, but not necessarily serious or serious. In the past, we've asked people what agency, what state agency would you like to run? This time, I think we'll go back to a perennial. In the first 100 days of a new administration, if we have a new administration, if people are organized, what should a new administration seek to do in the first 100 days as it relates to the subjects we've been talking about? Who wants to start? Who wants to start?
I would hope that the administration understands the popular sentiment for equity, and that it announces an initiative of stakeholders to rethink transit and the investment in transit across the country and the diverse systems that exist.
That's good.
I was recently asked this question by an organization trying to develop a list of things to do. And I developed 3 pages of bullets. So I'm not going to go through that. But I am going to raise just 2 thoughts that we could get moving very, very quickly. One is going into the new starts and small starts transit programs and seeing which projects are ready to go and getting them moving. This administration has gotten a little bit better, but they have really slow walked these projects, and we need to be deploying them as soon as we can. The second thing is I would love to go into the BUILD program, which is the most popular competitive grant program at USDOT. Used to be called the Tiger program, which as an LSU grad, I much preferred, but they abandoned it. When I was working there, and since I've left, I've recognized how challenging it is for smaller and poorer communities to apply for. They need to make it easier for lower capacity communities to apply. Those are 2 things they could do super duper quick and would deploy good projects equally quickly.
So Congressman, I like your idea of assembling a task force that actually does something and comes up with real meaningful recommendations. I'm aware that the federal funding formulas for local transit, for biking and walking, is based on population. And that population is a census of not 2020, but 2000. So we have a 20-year-old formula that was popular when AOL would be still sending you discs to install on your computer and you'd had dial-up. That is the formula that is running federal spending for transportation. So my first 100-day thing would be, let's get a new administration to come up with a list. We'll start with Beth's list and your group that you've suggested, that a task force of not just people in the Beltway, not just tasseled, loafered lobbyists, but instead people who actually use transit, use biking and walking, and come up with an agenda for the next, hopefully, 8 years. That would be my list. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We'd like to have you come back, Congressman. And Beth, thank you for being a perennial expert and a perennial co-host, if you will, on this show. If you like this show, please like it, subscribe. We'll be continuing to do these updates. Our hope is to get other members of Congress to speak, but the inaugural member of this broadcast who's a member of Congress is Congressman Garcia. We want to thank you for watching. Log on to our website, which is mobilityandaccess.org. If you need more information about this or the matching fund, which we've started up for grassroots organizations. And we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.